I'm going to talk a little bit about American foreign policy today. Not about the foreign policy of other countries, though there are a number of them represented here and that are of great and growing importance, particularly in what we call the global south. My basic theme is you may not be interested in the outside world, but the outside world is certainly interested in you and in me. We have just been through and are still going through 3 years of a pandemic, which came from abroad and has affected every one of us, including Wesleyan, closed down for a while. That may or may not be over. There may or may not be others, which are an effect of travel and particularly air travel coming to us. And then, of course, the biggest issue of all, which is climate change, which is affecting everybody in the world. And I don't mean to be lugubrious, but it's going to be the most difficult issue that the human race has ever faced in its entirety, at least since the last ice age. And I don't mean what happened in Buffalo in December. All disciplines, incidentally, every single one that's represented here and beyond is going to be involved in the outside world, if you haven't already discovered that, including all the people who come to Wesleyan from around the world, which has been a tremendous impact, favorable impact on what happens at Wesleyan and elsewhere, and which we can see reflected in this rather extraordinary program that was put today. Now, another factor in that's very important has been air travel. People can come from everywhere. And then electronic interconnections. I would say of TikTok, Facebook, and others, I consider them antisocial social media, which tend, if I may say so, from my generation, tend to isolate as much as they do to integrate, particularly because in which certain social media can inflate the existence of things happening in the world. My wife, who's an immigrant who first came here a few decades ago, would see all this stuff on television and say, this must be a sick society. I said, wait a second. You can find in America with 330 million people, at least one of everything. And if the media decide to center on that, you're going to think we're a sick society, but we're not. We're an extremely healthy society. And frankly, I have every confidence in the future of democracy. But I would like to get rid of a lot of the anti-social social media. And what our parents said to us when we were kids, why don't you just go outside and play? Leave your electronics behind. Now, for Americans, there are a number of big shifts taking place. Let's face it up. Beginning with Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, ended American isolation from the outside world. Our two broad oceans no longer protected us from interference, direct interference in American security from abroad. Except for Pancho Villa a little bit in 1916, it was the first attack on the lower 48, as we now call it, since August the 24th of 1814, when they burned the town in which I'm now. The British burned the town where I'm sitting there. Then with the end of the Cold War, which began to happen on the, what was it, the 9th of, let's see, no, the 9th of November in 1989 through September the 11th, I got it right, not 11, 2001. We called it the holiday from history, the time between the two 9/11s. The Europeans, you may know, write their dates backward. They don't get it right. And we pretended that we had nothing that we had to worry about in the outside world. But 9/11 ended for all times American insulation from the outside world. And we now know that we are now and forever fully integrated abroad. And frankly, Wesleyan illustrates that in its own student body and its own work. A number of things have happened as a result to the United States. We have for a long time had hopes of what is sometimes called hegemony, that we'd be able to call most of the shots in the world. And during the Cold War, we did in terms of big policy, in part because allies and others had to shelter under the American wings in confrontation with the Soviet Union. And during the nuclear standoff that only ended when the Soviet Union ended, which was Christmas night, that is the Western Christmas, in 2001. But our hopes for hegemony are now gone for a variety of reasons. Among other things, other countries now get a vote. Other countries are able to say what it is they would like to see happen in the world. So it's not just the United States calling the shots. Other countries don't have to shelter under our wings, at least to the extent that they used to. And it's been a shock to the system of a lot of people in foreign policy. Now, there are really three big areas I'm going to talk about for another 6 minutes, plus the global south. And this is going to be the century to a great extent of Africa, and maybe even Central America, as one of the great newspaper columnists said about 50 years ago. The United States will do anything for Latin America except read about it. Well, we're going to have to change that too. I'm going to mention three big areas, but also look at India. India is coming up on the outside. When I started in this business a number of years ago, India was, I hope I don't insult anybody, considered a basket case. It was way behind economically, and now it is one of the leading technological and even industrial and also economic powers in the world. I know, for example, because I have phone calls from somewhere in southern India several times a day trying to sell me something. Okay, the three big conflicts. Number one, beginning on the 24th of February last year, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which actually began in 2014 when Russia seized Crimea, which historically probably wasn't in Ukraine anyway. It was really, most recently before that, was part of Russia, but was made a present by Khrushchev in 1953 from part of the Soviet Union, that was Russia, to part of the Soviet Union, that was Ukraine. And suddenly, when the Soviet Union came to an end, Ukraine found itself with Crimea. So in 2014, they seized that. And then this extraordinary war, and it is a war, going on since a year ago this week. And let us face it, the United States is at war. The fact that we do not have troops directly engaged, and that there has been a kind of a tacit agreement that we, with weapons from the West used by Ukrainians, will not be used against Russia proper. And Mr. Putin, the aggressor, has tacitly agreed that he's not going to attack actual NATO allies. We're involved in war, and we're going to be involved for some time unless we can find a way out of it, and we're not there yet. But the point I want to illustrate here is our hands weren't clean. A number of things that we did wrong during the period after the end of the Cold War, George H.W. Bush said, let's build a Europe whole and free. Well, we tried that under Bush, and then under the administration I served, Clinton, to do that. Then some people decided Russia lost the Cold War, to hell with them. And that helped create conditions where the Russian people, in the majority, support what Putin is doing. Doesn't excuse it, but it also shows how difficult it is. Persian Gulf, we're to a great extent preoccupied with Iran. That goes back, of course, to the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the standoff between us and the Iranians and some other partners in the Middle East, especially Israel and Iran. But President Obama had a great amount of courage to come up with an agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, everything has a name, which was designed to stop the Iranian bomb. Mr. Trump got out of that agreement to a great extent because of U.S. domestic politics. And Mr. Biden, who could have resumed it right away and thereby stopping again the Iranian nuclear program, didn't do it. He didn't do it because of U.S. domestic politics. And we may be very close now to having a war with Iran. In fact, a couple of leading members of the administration said in the last couple of weeks that Iran is very close to getting the bomb. We could have stopped that, but we didn't do it. That's a mistake. Now, the question of China, which is rising up again from almost nothing a few decades ago to be the number 2 and someday, at some point, number 1 economic power in the world, and is becoming assertive. That is a natural development. And what we have failed so far to do, bipartisan, is to integrate the different aspects of American requirements, engagements with China, the human rights, the military, the commercial, the investment, North Korea. We haven't integrated that. We're going to have to do that. Now, what do we do? With regard to the big 3 and generally, first, learn history. Number 1 in foreign affairs, history. Without that and knowing other people's histories, we're not in the game. And that also means learning their cultures, their psychology, where they're coming from. Because if you don't know that, you're not in the game. And that includes what I call curiosity travel. Travel abroad, but learn stuff while you're doing it. Number 2, do it cross-disciplinary, which means everybody in the room, everybody at Wesleyan is going to have a need to be involved. Number 3, we have to train a new generation beyond the rigid thinkers of the old Cold War period. We went through after the end of the Cold War, in which intellectually we disarmed in foreign affairs. We got to learn that all over again, maybe with a new generation, and that's you. We have to try to avoid new Cold Wars, which is rigid thinking, highly dangerous, and denies us flexibility. That's where we are today. We have to be able to offset different things that we're worried about. And we have to go beyond ideologies. The world in general doesn't work according to ideology, it works according to the reality of the world. We have to get our leaders to recognize what I've just talked about. And quite frankly, most of the last 4 or 5 U.S. presidents have not done so on a bipartisan basis. Now, some added things, a couple of things for us, you and me. Number 1, read, not just history and cultures, but when you're presented with a document, read the document. Last week, the Chinese proposed a peace plan for Ukraine, been totally rubbished in the American media and by the American government. I recommend read it. It's actually a document that we could negotiate from, but nobody reads it. They just accept what the media tell us to do. And incidentally, don't believe automatically what you read and hear in the mainstream media. I don't look to the New York Times or the Washington Post to tell me the truth. I don't look to the big networks or CNN or Fox, if you're so inclined, to tell me the truth. I look at all kinds of things. I talk to people I trust. I talk to myself. I talk to my wife, and then I make up my mind. But I'll tell you, if you just listen to the mainstream media, they will capture you as they try to capture me too. Basically, and go beyond social media. Social media is the second worst invention of the industrial age, the other being the internal combustion engine, which is giving us climate change. Think for yourself. And then I had another thing, I'll end on this. Good idea, if you're interested in foreign affairs, get involved. Come to Washington, work in the government. Start by working on Capitol Hill. There are thousands of jobs. It's open to young people. You get a lot of responsibility. Now, I came up with an idea, I invented an idea a few years ago. It's very important both to be a student of government and foreign affairs and to be a practitioner of government and foreign affairs. Then I discovered that it was not a new idea. It was thought up by some other guy. He was a Greek. His name was Aristotle. Thank you very much.